For 14 years, a salt plant poisoned his grandfather's land. At 18, he inherited the debt, the dead soil, and a final, cryptic request. What he built there would change everything. If you're new here and you believe in second chances, maybe stick around and subscribe. We tell stories about finding a way forward when it feels like there isn't one. The bus seat vibrated with a low, tooth-rattling hum that had been my only constant for the last 6 hours. It was a cheap, cross-state coach, the kind with vinyl seats that were cracked like old leather and smelled faintly of disinfectant and despair. I was 18 years old. 18 for exactly 7 hours and 12 minutes. The state of Illinois, in its infinite and bureaucratic wisdom, had given me a cardboard box with my few possessions, a final check for $200, and a one-way bus ticket to a town called Viridian. It was a discharge, not a graduation. You don't graduate from the system.
You just get pushed out the door when the clock strikes midnight on your 18th birthday. I pressed my forehead against the cold glass, watching the flat, gray landscape slide by. The sky was the color of dishwater, a thin, uniform sheet of cloud that promised a rain it was too tired to deliver. 2 years in the group home. Before that, 3 different foster families. Before that, a life I only remembered in flashes of color and sound, like a badly damaged film reel. My grandfather was in those flashes, his hands calloused and smelling of soil. His voice, a low rumble like distant thunder. He was the only real family I had, and he was gone. He died 2 months ago, and I hadn't even been allowed to go to the funeral. Wards of the state, my caseworker explained, have complicated travel permissions. He said it with the same emotional investment he used to describe the lunch menu. In my jacket pocket, my fingers found the worn edges of the envelope. It had arrived yesterday, forwarded from a law office in Viridian. Inside was a key, a deed to a property I'd never seen, and a brief, typed note saying I was the sole heir to the estate of Arthur Jensen. My grandfather. The key was heavy in my palm. It felt ancient, made of real iron, the kind of key that opened a lock with loud, satisfying clicks. It felt like a responsibility I didn't want and an anchor I desperately needed. The bus slowed, its air brakes hissing like a tired dragon. A sign flashed past the window, faded green paint peeling from a metal plate. Viridian, Pop, 942. The number felt generous. The bus pulled into a gravel lot beside a gas station that looked like it had been closed since the Carter administration. The door folded open, and the driver, a man with a weary slump to his shoulders, looked at me in the rearview mirror. "This is it, kid," he said. "End of the line." I was the only one who got off. I stood in the gravel lot, my cardboard box in one hand and a thin backpack over my shoulder. The air was different here. It was heavy, and it carried a strange, metallic scent on the breeze, something sharp and chemical. The town was a single main street, a collection of brick buildings with faded awnings and dusty windows. A hardware store, a diner with a flickering neon sign, a post office. It was a place that time had forgotten to update. I felt a dozen pairs of eyes on me from behind those windows, the silent, immediate appraisal of a small town for a stranger. I pulled out the lawyer's note, Albright and Associates. The address was just 2 blocks down. I adjusted the box in my arms and started walking. My life, all of it, fit inside a single cardboard container. It didn't seem right. It didn't seem like enough. The law office was on the 2nd floor of the only 2-story building on the street, above the hardware store. The stairs creaked under my weight, each step a complaint. The office was one room, filled with filing cabinets the color of sand, and a thick carpet that had once been green. A woman sat behind a large wooden desk, her hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch the skin at her temples. She looked up from her paperwork, her eyes sharp and assessing. "Can I help you?" she asked. Her voice was clipped, efficient. "I'm Leo Jensen," I said, my own voice sounding thin and young. "I think you're expecting me." She was Ms. Albright.
She nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. Yes, Mr. Jensen. Please, have a seat. The chair opposite her desk was hard and unforgiving. She pulled a thick file from a drawer. It was tabbed and organized, a stark contrast to the chaotic mess of my own life. I was your grandfather's attorney, she said, opening the file. I am the executor of his will. It's not a complex document. He left everything to you. His property, his personal effects, and, unfortunately, his debts. She slid a piece of paper across the desk. It was a ledger of some kind. My eyes scanned the columns. Property taxes, 2 years in arrears. A lien from a medical collections agency. The final number at the bottom made the $200 in my pocket feel like pocket change. The property, she continued, steepling her fingers, is 5 acres on the edge of town. It has a small farmhouse, a barn. It's not in the best condition. Your grandfather, he wasn't well for the last few years. She paused, letting the silence hang in the air. There's also the matter of the offer. Offer? I asked. Titan Salt, she said, as if the name itself was an explanation. They own the adjacent property, a large brine processing facility. They've been trying to buy your grandfather's land for years. They've made a final offer to the estate. She named a number. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to clear the debts and leave me with a few $1,000s. Enough to get an apartment somewhere else, to start over. It was a clean slate, a way out. Why do they want it so badly? I asked. Albright sighed, a small, tired sound. They want to expand their evaporation ponds, and frankly, Leo, the land isn't worth much to anyone else. There's a problem with the soil. She leaned forward, her professional mask cracking just a little, revealing a hint of something that might have been pity. For over a decade, Titan has had a runoff issue, a leaky discharge pipe. They've been dumping concentrated brine along your grandfather's fence line. It's saturated the western half of his property. Nothing grows there. It's a saline wasteland. They settled with your grandfather years ago for a pittance, an amount that barely covered his legal fees. They have him, and now you, in a corner. So that was the smell. The sharp, metallic tang in the air. It was salt, industrial, chemical salt. My advice, she said, her voice softening slightly, is to take the offer, pay the debts, take what's left and find a new place to start. There's nothing for you here. This town, this property, it's a dead end. It was the same advice I'd been getting my whole life, in different forms, from different people in beige offices. The sensible path. The easy way out. Don't fight. Don't get attached. Just move on. For a moment, I almost agreed. It was a clean break. But then I thought of the heavy iron key in my pocket. I thought of my grandfather's hands, smelling of earth. The earth they had poisoned. I want to see it first, I said. The words came out before I had a chance to second-guess them. Ms. Albright looked at me, a flicker of surprise in her eyes. The property is 2 miles east of town. You can't miss it. It's the last house on Salt Road. She handed me a map she'd drawn on the back of a business card. The offer from Titan Salt stands for 30 days, Leo. Don't be a fool. I stood up, taking the map. Thank you for your time. As I walked out, I felt her eyes on my back. I wasn't just a client to her. I was a problem to be solved, a loose end to be tied up. And I had just refused to be neatly filed away. The walk to the property was longer than I expected. The pavement of Main Street gave way to a cracked asphalt road, which in turn became packed dirt. Salt Road. The name was literal. A fine white dust coated the sides of the road, clinging to the dry weeds. I could see the plant in the distance, a sprawling complex of metal buildings, silos, and vast, shimmering pools that reflected the gray sky. A low industrial hum pulsed from it, a constant mechanical heartbeat. The air grew thicker with the chemical smell. It stung my nostrils. And then I saw it, A small, white farmhouse, its paint peeling like a sunburn. A sagging porch, a roof patched with mismatched shingles. Behind it, a large, weathered gray barn. A wire fence separated the property from the industrial sprawl of Titan salt. And the land. Ms. Albright hadn't been exaggerating. On my side of the fence, the grass was brown and patchy, but it was there. A few stubborn, scraggly trees clung to life. On the other side, along the fence where the plant loomed, the ground was stark white. It looked like a fresh snowfall, but it wasn't snow. It was a crust of salt, thick and crystalline, stretching 50 yards into my grandfather's property. Nothing grew there, not a weed, not a blade of grass. The earth was dead, sterilized. I walked to the fence line. I could see the pipe, a wide, corrugated metal tube jutting out from under the Titan fence. A dark, wet stain spread from its mouth, feeding the white desert. This was it. This was my inheritance. A broken-down house, a mountain of debt, and 5 acres of land, half of which had been systematically murdered. I reached the front door of the house. The wood was splintered around the lock. I slid the heavy iron key from my pocket. It felt cold against my palm. For a moment, I hesitated. Ms. Albright's words echoed in my head. Take the money. Start fresh. Don't be a fool. It was the smart play, the logical move. But logic had never felt like home. My grandfather had stayed. He had lived here, on this poisoned land, until the day he died. He hadn't run. I put the key in the lock. It turned with a series of loud, grating clicks, the sound of something waking up after a long sleep. The door swung inward on a groan of rusty hinges, releasing a wave of stale, trapped air. I stepped across the threshold, from the gray afternoon, into the deep shadows of the house. The door swung shut behind me, and the world outside disappeared. I was alone with the ghosts. The silence inside was absolute. It was a heavy, weighted silence, made of dust and memory. Light struggled through grime-caked windows, cutting weak diagonal stripes across the floor. Dust motes swirled in the beams like tiny, captured stars. The house was small. A main room that served as a living area and kitchen, and 2 doors leading off it. Everything was covered in a thin layer of dust, a gray blanket that softened all the edges. It was like a photograph left to fade in the sun. But it wasn't empty. It was full of him. His presence was in the armchair by the window, its fabric worn smooth in the shape of a man. It was in the stack of books on the side table, mostly about soil science and history. It was in the faint, lingering scent of pipe tobacco and old wood. I ran my hand along the back of the armchair. The fabric was rough under my fingertips. I could almost picture him sitting there, looking out the window at the land, his land. I walked into the kitchen area. A thick ceramic mug sat by the sink, a dark ring of coffee still visible at the bottom. A calendar on the wall was turned to a month 2 months ago. Each day was crossed out with a firm, black X, right up until his last one. The neat, methodical lines of a man who paid attention to the passing of time. This wasn't just a property. It was the last place my grandfather had been alive. Signing it away suddenly felt like a betrayal. It felt like erasing him. I opened one of the doors. It led to a small bedroom. A simple iron bed frame, a wooden dresser, a nightstand. The bed was neatly made, the blanket pulled taut. It looked like he had just stepped out for a moment. And under the bed I saw it. A dark green metal footlocker, the kind soldiers use. It was closed with a heavy padlock. I knelt on the dusty floorboards. I tried the key from the front door, but it didn't fit. I checked the other key on the ring, a smaller, simpler one. It slid into the padlock. With a click, it sprung open. My heart was pounding. For a second, I let myself imagine it was full of cash.
a secret stash that would solve all my problems. The sensible part of my brain, the part that sounded like Ms. Albright, knew better. I lifted the heavy lid. The inside smelled of old paper and cedar. There was no money. Instead, it was filled with journals. A dozen of them, leather-bound and filled with his tight, spidery handwriting. There were stacks of photographs, held together with rubber bands that had gone brittle with age. And on top of it all, a thick, yellowed manila envelope. My name was written on the front in his familiar script, Leo. I lifted the envelope out. It was heavy, thick with papers. My hands were trembling slightly as I broke the dried-out seal. I sat on the edge of the bed, the footlocker open at my feet, and began to read the letter inside. It was dated a week before he died. "My dear Leo," it began. "If you are reading this, then I am gone, and the state has finally seen fit to send you home. I am sorry I could not be here to welcome you. I am sorry for so much. I know your life has not been easy, and I know I have been a ghost in it. They told me it was for the best. They told me a broken old man on a failing farm was no place for a boy to grow up. I let them convince me. It is my life's greatest regret." I had to stop and take a breath. The formal, distant grandfather from my fragmented memories was gone, replaced by this voice on the page, a voice filled with a pain that mirrored my own. I read on. "They will try to make you sell this place," he wrote. "A lawyer, a woman from the bank, the company next door. They will tell you it is worthless. They will show you the debts and the dead soil, and they will tell you to run. And they will be right, in a way. By every conventional measure, this land is ruined. But I need you to know that it was not always this way. This land was good. It was alive." He went on to describe the farm as it had been decades ago. He wrote about the richness of the soil, the sweetness of the well water. He wrote about my grandmother, a woman I'd never met, and the garden she had kept. He was painting a picture of a place I couldn't recognize, a paradise that had been paved over with salt. Then Titan salt arrived, the letter continued. They came with promises of jobs and progress. At first, it was fine. But then the leaks started. Small at first, then worse. I complained. I filed reports. I hired a lawyer. I fought them for 5 years, Leo. I have the documents to prove it, all in this box. They buried me in paperwork. Their lawyers delayed and obfuscated. They bled me dry. I lost. They gave me a pittance of a settlement with a clause that I could never sue them for the same issue again. They had won. They had poisoned my land and paid pennies for the privilege. A cold, hard anger started to form in my chest. It was an old, familiar feeling. The anger of helplessness. The anger of watching a big, faceless system crush something small and important. "I almost gave up," he wrote. "I almost sold. I sat in that armchair for a whole winter, just watching the white crust creep farther and farther across the field. I watched the birds stop landing there. I watched the earth die. And I hated them for it. The hate was a poison of its own. It was eating me alive. And then, one spring morning, something changed. I was reading a book about old-world farming practices, and I came across a section on Spanish jamón and Italian prosciutto. It described the salt flats of certain coastal regions, the unique mineral composition of the air, and how that specific, salt-heavy environment was the secret to creating the world's most prized cured meats. It wasn't just about salt. It was about the right kind of salt, full of trace minerals from the sea. The book said that the environment itself was an ingredient you couldn't replicate. I could feel the shift in the letter's tone. The despair was giving way to something else, a spark of an idea. I went outside and I looked at that dead soil. And then I looked at the lab analysis of the brine that Titan was dumping. My lawyer had commissioned it for the lawsuit. It was a chemical slurry, full of sodium chloride, yes, but also potassium, magnesium, and a dozen other trace minerals. It was an industrial waste product, but its composition,
It was remarkably similar to the mineral profile of seawater. They weren't just dumping salt. They were dumping a corrupted, concentrated version of the ocean onto my land. They had inadvertently created a unique, if toxic, terroir. So I started an experiment. It sounds crazy, I know. An old man's folly. But I had nothing left to lose. I bought a few books. I learned about curing, about salinity and humidity and time. I built a small curing chamber in the back of the barn, hidden away. I wanted it to be insulated from the world, a clean space amidst the decay. I started small, a piece of pork belly, a loin. I failed, a lot. Molds I didn't want, cures that were too salty or not salty enough. It was a disaster. But I kept records of everything, every failure, every small success. I was a scientist in my own barn. And slowly, painstakingly, I started to figure it out. My eyes scanned the page, reading faster and faster. The story was pulling me in, this secret history of my grandfather's last years. He wasn't a victim succumbing to despair. He was a rebel, a mad scientist. I learned to use the land itself, he wrote. Not the soil, but the air. The salt that hung in the air from the evaporation ponds was a part of the process. It settled on everything. I learned to balance it, to work with it. I was turning their weapon against them. I was taking their poison and using it to create something beautiful. The last batch, Leo. The one I finished last month. It's the one. The flavor is complex. It's savory and sweet, and it has a mineral finish you can't find anywhere else. It tastes of this place. It tastes of the struggle. It is the best thing I have ever made. I have left a piece for you, vacuum sealed. It is in the curing shed. The letter was nearing its end. I don't have the strength to take this any further. The fight is over for me. But maybe, for you, it's just beginning. This is your inheritance, Leo. Not the dead. Not the dead land. This idea. This process. Don't fight them in a courtroom. That is a game we cannot win. Fight them in the marketplace. Take their poison and sell it back to them as a delicacy. Make something so good that people will pay a premium for it. Turn their greatest liability into our greatest asset. It is a long shot. It is a fool's errand. But it is all I have to leave you. A choice. You can take their money and walk away. No one would blame you. Or you can stay. You can learn. You can finish what I started. The choice is yours. Whatever you decide, know that I am proud of the man you are becoming. Your grandfather, Arthur. I let the letter fall into my lap. The room was silent, but my mind was screaming. It was too much. It was a burden and a gift, all at once. I felt the crushing weight of his expectation and the soaring hope of his vision. Grief washed over me in a powerful, unexpected wave. I cried. I cried for the grandfather I barely knew, but who had clearly loved me so fiercely. I cried for his lonely fight, for his quiet genius. I cried for the years we had lost. And I cried because I was 18 years old, standing in a dead man's house, and I had no idea what to do. The sensible voice, the Miss Albright voice, was screaming at me. This is insane, a fantasy. You're not a chef. You're not a businessman. You're a kid who just aged out of the system. Take the money. It's the only real thing on the table. The offer from Titan Salt was a lifeboat. My grandfather's letter was an invitation to learn how to build my own ship in the middle of a storm. I sat there for what felt like hours, the silence of the house pressing in on me. I thought about the group home, the endless rules, the beige walls, the feeling of being a number in a file, the constant, low-grade humiliation of having your life managed by strangers who didn't care about you. All my life, I had been told what to do, where to go, who to be. I had followed the path of least resistance because I had to. Survival meant being quiet, being compliant. Taking the offer was the compliant thing to do. It was the next logical step in a life of being managed. But my grandfather's letter offered something else. It wasn't a plan. It was a dare. It was a transfer of agency. He wasn't telling me what to do. He was trusting me to make a choice. And that was a gift I had never been given before. It's a strange thing to be terrified and energized at the same time. The fear was a cold knot in my stomach. The fear of failure, of poverty, of being utterly alone. But underneath it, there was a flicker of something else. A hot, bright spark of defiance. The idea was so audacious, so poetic. Take their poison and sell it back to them. It was a story of alchemy. It was a story of resurrection. And it was a story I desperately wanted to be a part of. Have you ever been at a crossroads like that? A moment where you have two doors in front of you. One is safe, sensible, and leads to a life you can predict. The other is terrifying, uncertain, and leads to a place you can't even imagine. If you've been there, if you know that feeling in your gut, let me know in the comments. I read them all. Because I think that one choice, that single moment of deciding to turn towards the scary door, is what defines us. It's where our real story begins. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. I stood up and walked out of the bedroom, through the dusty living room, and out the back door. The barn was bigger up close, its gray wood weathered to the texture of an old man's skin. The main doors were chained shut, but the letter had mentioned a smaller side door. I found it, hidden behind a tangle of overgrown bushes. It was unlocked. I pulled it open and stepped inside. The barn was vast and dark, smelling of hay and dust and time. Light streamed in through cracks in the walls, illuminating a cavernous space filled with old, rusted farm equipment and stacks of rotting bales. But in the far back corner, partitioned off by new-looking plywood, was a small, windowless room. A heavy insulated door was set into the wall. This was it, the curing shed. I took a deep breath and opened the door. The air that hit me was completely different. It was cool, clean, and smelled faintly of salt and spice, and something else, something rich and deeply savory. The room was small, no bigger than a closet, but it was immaculate. The walls were lined with stainless steel. A hygrometer and a thermometer were mounted on the wall, their needles perfectly steady. And hanging from a series of hooks were meats. Different shapes and sizes, all encased in a thin, white, powdery mold that I knew from my grandfather's letter was a sign of a good, slow cure. This was his laboratory, his sanctuary. On a small steel table, there was a vacuum sealer and a single, sealed plastic pouch. Inside was a piece of meat, dark red and marbled with creamy white fat. A label was stuck to the pouch, written in my grandfather's hand. Lonzino, batch 12. Taste this one. I picked it up. It was cool and firm. This was the proof. This was the culmination of his crazy, brilliant experiment. I took it back to the house, found a knife in a kitchen drawer, and sliced the package open. I cut a thin, almost translucent slice. The aroma was incredible. It wasn't just pork. It was nutty, earthy, with a hint of sweetness. I put the piece in my mouth. The texture was like silk. The flavor exploded on my tongue. It was salty, of course, but it was a complex, mineral saltiness that was perfectly balanced by the rich, savory flavor of the pork. And then the finish. Ms. Albright had called the land a saline wasteland. My grandfather had called the flavor a mineral finish. They were both right. It tasted of the place. It tasted of resilience. It was, without a doubt, the most delicious thing I had ever eaten in my entire life. And in that moment, the choice was made. The fear was still there, but the defiance had won. The spark had become a flame. This was my legacy. This was my fight. I walked back into town the next morning. The sky was still gray, but it felt different. It felt like a canvas waiting for color. I walked up the creaking stairs to the law office. Ms. Albright was at her desk, just as before. She looked up, and her expression was one of tired expectation. "Leo," she said, "have you come to sign the papers?" "No," I said. My voice didn't shake. "I'm not selling." She stared at me, her mouth slightly open. She blinked, as if she hadn't heard me correctly. "I'm sorry?" "I'm keeping the property," I said. "I'm going to live there, and I'm going to pay off the debts." She leaned back in her chair, studying me. The pity was gone, replaced by a sharp, professional skepticism. "With what, exactly? The $200 the state gave you?" "With the business I'm going to build," I said. The words sounded audacious, even to me, but I said them anyway. I said them for my grandfather. I said them for myself. For the first time, she looked genuinely thrown. "What business?" "Leo, there is nothing on that land but a broken-down house and poison." "You're wrong," I said. "There's a future there." I didn't explain. I didn't need her to understand. I just needed her to file the right paperwork. "I'll be in touch about a payment plan for the taxes," I told her, and then I turned and walked out, leaving her sitting in stunned silence. The first year was the hardest. I was broke and I was alone. I took the last of my money and the $200 from the state and spent it on the absolute essentials, paying the fee to keep the electricity on, buying basic food, and purchasing a few high-quality pork loins from a farmer a few towns over. His name was Mr. Gable, a gruff old man with hands like shovels who looked at me with deep suspicion. But he raised good pigs, and my grandfather's notes said his were the best. I spent my days cleaning the house, scrubbing away the years of dust and neglect. I fixed the leaky faucet, patched the drafty window, and made the small space livable. It was hard, physical work, but it felt good. It felt like I was claiming the space, making it my own. At night, I read. I devoured my grandfather's journals, cross-referencing them with the books on charcuterie he'd left behind. I learned about the science of it all, pH levels, water activity, the delicate dance between salt, time, and humidity. I learned the names of good molds and bad molds. His journals were my textbook and my teacher. He had documented everything, every single variable, the temperature in the barn, the barometric pressure, the precise mineral content of the salt he harvested from the dead soil. He had created a blueprint. All I had to do was learn how to read it. I got a job washing dishes at the diner in town, the one with the flickering sign. It was 4 nights a week, a late shift that left my hands raw and smelling of grease. But it was cash, and it was enough to buy more pork, to pay the next electric bill, to keep the lights on. The owner, a woman named Sarah, was tough but fair. She watched me for a few weeks. Then one night, she asked me what a kid like me was doing out at the old Jensen place. I told her I was fixing it up. I didn't tell her the whole truth, not yet. My first few batches of charcuterie were failures. I followed the notes exactly, but I was clumsy. I contaminated one batch with bad mold. I oversalted another until it was inedible. Each failure was a gut punch. It was expensive pork and money I couldn't afford to waste. There were nights I'd sit at the kitchen table, my head in my hands, the smell of my ruined work in the air, and I'd think about Ms. Albright's offer, the easy way out. But then I would read another passage from my grandfather's journal, his calm, steady voice reminding me that failure was part of the process. "Patience, Leo," he wrote. "The meat is teaching you. You have to learn to listen." So I kept going. I learned to be more meticulous, more patient. I learned the feel of it, the rhythm of the work. I started to understand what he meant. It wasn't just science, it was an art. It was a conversation with time. After 6 months of trial and error, I produced my first successful batch of Lonzino. It was a small victory, but it tasted like hope. It tasted exactly like the piece he had left for me. I took a piece to Sarah at the diner. I was nervous, my hands sweating as I handed her the small, paper-wrapped package. She looked at it, then at me. She unwrapped it, sliced a thin piece with her thumbnail, and tasted it. Her eyes widened. She took another piece. "Where did you get this?" she asked, her voice low. "I made it," I said. "Out at the farm." She looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time. "You're kidding me." I told her the story. The whole thing. The salt, the letters, the secret shed. She listened, her expression unreadable. When I was finished, she was silent for a long time. Then she nodded slowly. "Your grandfather was a stubborn old coot," she said. "But he wasn't crazy." The next week, she put a new item on her specials board. A plowman's lunch, featuring locally cured Jensen loin. She charged a fortune for it, and it sold out the first night. That was the beginning. I started selling my charcuterie at the local farmer's market on Saturdays. I had a small, wobbly card table and a hand-painted sign, Brine and Bone. The name came to me one night. It was about the salt, the brine, but it was also about the foundation, the bones of the place, of my family. At first, people were hesitant. They knew the Jensen place. They knew about the salt. But a few brave souls tried a sample, and then they came back with their friends. Word started to spread through the town, then to the neighboring towns. People were fascinated by the story, but they came back for the flavor. They loved the unique mineral tang that was my secret ingredient, my inheritance. My work settled into a rhythm. Dishwashing at night, charcuterie during the day. I slowly paid down the debts. I started to fix up the barn, expanding my curing space. I bought better equipment. I started experimenting with new products, using my grandfather's notes as a guide. Copa, bresaola, even a long-aged ham. Mr. Gable, the pig farmer, started calling me by my first name. He'd inspect my latest batch with a critical eye, then grunt in what I came to understand as approval. Miss Albright would nod at me on the street, a look of grudging respect in her eyes. I wasn't a problem to be managed anymore. I was becoming a part of the town. One Saturday, a woman with a fancy camera and a notebook spent a long time at my market stall. She asked a lot of questions. She was a food blogger from Chicago, she said, always looking for unique local producers. I told her my story. She took a lot of pictures. She bought one of everything I had. I didn't think much of it until 2 weeks later, when my phone started ringing. It was a number I didn't recognize. The blogger's article had gone up. She called my charcuterie a triumph of alchemy and the most exciting new food product in the Midwest. She wrote about the poisoned land, the grandfather's legacy, and the kid from the system who was turning industrial waste into culinary gold. The article was shared thousands of times. My little brand, Brine and Bone, was suddenly famous. The calls were from restaurants in the city, high-end delis, specialty food shops. They all wanted my product. I was completely overwhelmed. I couldn't possibly meet the demand. I was still a one-man operation, washing dishes to make ends meet. And then, the biggest call came. The caller ID said it was from Austin, Texas. A calm, professional voice on the other end introduced herself. She was a regional buyer for Whole Foods Market. She had read the article. She had managed to get a sample of my Lonzino from one of the Chicago chefs. She said, "Mr. Jensen, we believe your product and your story are a perfect fit for our brand. We would like to discuss a potential partnership to bring Brine and Bone to our stores." I almost dropped the phone. Whole Foods. It was surreal. It was impossible. I looked out my kitchen window at the white, salt-crusted land stretching towards the humming, indifferent buildings of the Titan salt plant. For so long, that view had been a symbol of defeat, of loss. Now it was the source of my triumph. My grandfather's crazy idea, his last desperate act of defiance, had worked.
It had worked better than he could have ever imagined. The reflection came later, after the whirlwind of lawyers and contracts. I hired Miss Albright to represent me. The irony was not lost on either of us. She fought for me with a tenacity that was startling, securing a deal that was more than fair. The advance from Whole Foods was a number so large it felt like a typo. The first thing I did was walk into her office and write a check to pay off every last cent of my grandfather's debt. The look on her face was a mixture of pride and disbelief. I quit my job at the diner. Sarah hugged me so hard she lifted me off the floor. I used the money to hire a small team from the town, to properly renovate the barn into a state-of-the-art facility, and to start the long, slow process of restoring the farmhouse to the way it was in my grandfather's old photographs. I stood on the porch one evening, looking out at the property. The house behind me was warm and bright. The barn was humming with new life. And across the fence, the Titan salt plant continued its work, churning out its product, oblivious. They were still there. They were still dumping their brine. But it didn't matter anymore. They no longer had any power over me. My grandfather had taught me that you can't always choose the ground you stand on. Sometimes it's poisoned. Sometimes it's broken. Sometimes it's a place everyone else has written off. But you can choose what you build on it. He thought he was leaving me a problem, a choice between running and a fool's errand. But what he really left me was a purpose. He left me a home. That salt, that poison, was meant to be an ending. It was meant to erase a small family farm from the map. But we didn't let it. We made it a beginning. We took the thing that was meant to destroy us, and we made it the foundation of everything. If this story meant something to you, if it gave you a little bit of hope for a project or a problem in your own life, I hope you'll subscribe and become part of this community. We're all just trying to figure out what to build on the ground we've been given. And I want to ask you to share something in the comments below. What is the salt in your life? What's the challenge, the obstacle, or the wound that you are learning to build with? I promise I'll read as many as I can. Your story matters. Thank you for listening.